bear with me, and hopefully this won't be too boring. So these are some cell builders that are set up. As I was kind of describing before with the reverse split cell builder, we usually allow them to grow into 3 deeps. We usually use overwintered nukes for this, so they've overwintered on 8 frames. And in our setup, we actually have, on each pallet, there's 2 cell builders, and then behind each of the cell builders, there's another colony that's equally as strong that is a support colony. So we kind of hot rod our cell builders just because we're running an awful lot of queens through them, like 300 queen cells every 2 weeks. So we want to make sure there's lots and lots of nurse bees. So we're borrowing nurse bees from support colonies. So what type of queen cells are these? No.
A lot of emergency cells.
These are a lot of emergency cells. And so this picture is here because of what we were just talking about. We're going to make these cell builders queenless, and we're going to take advantage of the emergency response. You can tell they're not supersedure cells because they're stumpy and short, and they're coming out of a worker cell. The supersedure cells are fully separate from the comb, and you can see the entire cell, but they usually are not along the edges or the bottom, which differentiates them from a swarm cell. Okay, go ahead. So here we are setting up our cell builders. In that initial picture, 10 days before the graft, we put the queen excluders between the boxes. So we have at least 2 boxes that have not had queen in them for 10 days. Okay, now this is the day before the graft. We're getting set up. Does anybody know what this thing is? It's a horse. What kind of a horse?
It's just for putting your hives on, your boxes on.
Yeah, so what do we call it?
A hive horse.
It's a super horse.
Super horse.
And my kids like to say, super horse. If you have more than 2 hives, you should make a super horse. So the old timers did this too, back in the 1880s and the 1910s and the 1920s. It beats, if you've got like this year, we had 8, 10 supers on each colony, and you have to take them off to get a mite count. Well, it's a whole lot nicer to just set them on a horse than set them on the ground and then pick them all back up and stack them all back up again. And if some of the horses have hooks on the end, and you can come up behind a hive in the spring when you need to reverse it, you stick the hooks under it, and you can flip the whole thing right up onto its back on the horse, and you can do your reversing and checking of all the frames just sitting right there on the horse. You never picked up a box. And when you're done, you put it back together again, and you stand the whole thing back up. So, think about it. Go ahead. So we're going to take this apart. In this example, we set this up to show you without the support colonies behind. So what we've done here is we've located the box that has the queen in it by finding the box with the eggs. And we've taken it and we've put it on a second bottom board, which is facing backwards. So all the field bees are going to stay in the original colony, but that original colony is going to be queenless. Go ahead. Now we're going to look through the box with the queen to locate her. And we're going to set her aside. But again, you only have to look through one box. Go ahead. There she is. Go ahead. Trying to get away. Go ahead. And then we take her and we're going to put her, we actually just put them in a 5-frame nuke box temporarily just to keep her out of the way. So we don't lose her. So we just let her run down in. And then we look for frames of open brood that are covered with nurse bees. Go ahead. Go ahead. And what we do is we use the inner cover often to make a little ramp. And we'll shape 2 or 3 frames of nurse bees into that queenless box that's sitting in the front. And allow them to just walk up and in. So you're still shaking a few nurse bees, but it's pretty chill because they're nurse bees. They're not going to get aggressive. Go ahead. We use a slatted rack Partly because we're going to make this really crowded, so this gives them a little breathing room, they don't get quite so hot, and partly because it's going to support the queen excluder that we're going to put on the bottom. And I'll explain why we do that in just a little bit. Go ahead. There's the queen excluder on the bottom. And then we're going to take a queenless box, and we're going to set it right here. It wants to have sealed brood, it wants to have food, and it wants to have at least one outstanding frame of pollen. And I think we'll see pictures of those here directly. Go ahead. Yep, so here's some lovely sealed brood. Why don't we want open brood in the cell builder? They might raise queens on that. And if one of the larvae that they started as a queen was slightly too old when they chose it, what would happen?
She gets out first.
She would emerge first, and she would kill all of our queens that we want. And so the simplest way to avoid that is to just not give them any open brood to play with, except the queen cells that you want grafted. Whether you're using a frame from a colony that you like that has open brood that you've notched, or whether it's a frame that you've punched out, or whether it's a frame that you've grafted by hand into plastic cells, you make sure that none of the other frames in that box have open brood in them. And by the way you did that, I'll remind you, is by 10 days before, you put queen excluders between those boxes so that there's only open brood after 10 days in one of the boxes. An egg is an egg for 3 days, a larva is fed for 5 or 6 days, depending on which caste it is. So by the end of 10 days, there should be nothing. All right? So here's a lovely frame of brood. You have a few of these frames in there. You want to make sure those stay with the cell builder because those are going to be the nurse bees for your next graft 2 weeks later. Go ahead. Here's what you want for pollen. You don't want the old dark stuff that's been pickled, that's been coated with a layer of honey. You want the fresh stuff that's dry, that's just come in, that's going to be easy for the nurse bees to access and masticate and turn into royal jelly. That's what we're after, is lots and lots of nurse bees and lots of royal jelly to feed the queens.
Can I use this year's pollen that's in the freezer right now next?
As long as it looks like this, rather than the old stuff that's kind of shiny.
Stuff we're trapping out right now.
Yes, and so if you don't have a frame that looks like this, I know guys that will poach frames out of their honey production hive, so it doesn't have to come from the cell builder. If you can't find one of these in the cell builder, take it from a honey production colony. Problem is, they're usually in the bottom box, below the second box, below 5 supers, and so they're not easy to get at. So another option is to have a colony that you set aside that you put a pollen trap on. There's a couple out there, Brushy, which went out of business, used to sell a nice one. I think somebody is selling a fake version of it.
Okay, I haven't found that.
And what was
It was
that
called
like?
the front porch pollen trap, and the only difference was it mounted on the front, so you didn't have to pick the colony up to take it on and off. And it had a strip that had plastic, kind of asterisk-shaped holes in it, and so it did not rip off the wings and the legs when the bees went through.
Is it a plastic trap or a wooden trap?
It was a wooden trap.
Okay.
Somebody like Man Lake sells a plastic version that looks similar, but has the old style of plate to strip the pollen off the legs, which is much harder on the bees. So pollen trapping is dicey because it can injure a lot of your big field bees. But if you can find one of the ergonomic style, you don't get as much pollen because it's not as efficient at stripping all the pollen off the bees. But I never felt like I wanted to take all the pollen anyway. The point is they need it to raise the brood. So in the years when we were short of pollen, we have a couple of those traps. We can throw them on some support colonies. Then what you do is you take an empty comb, you take the yogurt container of pollen that you've gathered, and you just sprinkle it on there, and you can kind of rub it down in the cells. And that works just as good as a frame of bee collected pollen because it's fresh and it's right there. Okay, there's a front porch pollen trap. That's what they look like. They really get upset when you first put the strip in that they have to go through. So you'll get bees clustered all over the front, but eventually they'll figure out they have to pass through that. That's what the pollen looks like when you're collecting it. Go ahead. All right, here is your grafting frame. Everybody see all the larvae here? Mike Palmer had the best quote about the right age larva to graft. You want to find the smallest larva that you can see. And the one you want to graft is the one right next to it that you can't see. And so, get your LED flashlight, and I wear a jeweler's loupe, you know, a stereo magnifier, and I've actually got pretty decent eyesight, and I still much prefer to do it with magnification. There are a few people who can do it without, but don't bother. Get a big magnifying glass, get a pair to wear. Do you use reading glasses for it?
I had mine on today playing around with it, and
Yeah.
I used my reading glasses with it.
And
I had it on 3.5.
okay. So anything to give you some magnification, but it's really the light. And I say LED because it's this clear, bright, white light, which really illuminates the larva beautifully.
Really silly question.
No such thing.
Are you doing this in the yard, or are you pulling these frames, bringing them inside, and doing them inside, and then bringing them back?
You can do either. So it really depends on the temperature. A lot of guys, commercial guys, have a clean rearing yard that's kind of off, far away. And so some people have used a tent. I've seen guys doing it in the front seat of their truck with the heater going because it's 50 degrees out. You've got to keep the larva at 95, so you're in the truck stripped down to your skivvies, you know, with the heater cranked all the way up, and you're grafting, you know, with everything propped against the steering wheel. My queen rearing yard is set up 20 yards away from my honey house, and so we do the grafting in the honey house. Ideally, wherever you're grafting, it wants to be relatively high humidity, so 60 to 80% humidity. It wants to be ideally above 70 degrees, preferably in the 80s. And wind and direct sunlight will kill the larva. They'll either dry the larva out or overheat them. And so you want to avoid that. So if you're doing it outside, in the summer when it's warm, do it in the shade. But some guys will just have a picnic table out there, we'll graft right on the picnic table. Yep. So anything is fair game as long as the conditions, temperature-wise, are right. Here's how you set it up. When you have that box, that queenless box, you want to put your sealed brood on one side. These 3 frames are kind of centered in the box. So if you've got a 10-frame box, you'd have 3 or 4 frames on one side and either 3 or 4 frames on the other side. In my 8-frame box, I've got 1 fewer frame on each side. The open brood goes right in the middle. That is going to be where you put your graft the next day. And if you're just grafting a few cells, I don't know your name because you don't have a name tag.
Oh, sorry, it wasn't my Joanne.
Joanne, okay. Just you 3 that actually want to raise queens or want to call you by name. Joanne, if you don't like shaking nurse bees, you can just use the nurse bees that were on this frame. And that will be enough if you're just doing a few cells. Okay? You don't have to shake additional ones. It's standard for commercial operators to graft 45 cells, so 3 cell bars in one colony. And to have enough nurse bees to feed that, you need more than 1 frame's worth of nurse bees. But if you're doing, say, 8, then 1 frame's worth of nurse bees is going to be fine. Okay? So the day before, you're setting it up with open brood, sealed brood, and here's your beautiful frame of pollen on the other side. And then on the outside are frames of open nectar and other frames of sealed brood to strengthen it. A variation on this that we started doing this year, which I like very much, is to transfer this cell starting setup into a 5-frame nuke box. So we take it from a 2 or 3 deep colony and we move away the queen, we move away the extra box, we shake nurse bees, and then we consolidate everything into a 5-frame nuke box so that it's extremely crowded. which means that even more of the nurse bees are focused on that frame that you want. And we had good luck with that. We got really nice looking cells. It's one more transfer of the frames, but there's some advantages to that that I like that we can talk about later if anybody's interested. Okay, here's shaking some nurse bees like we talked about. You can see my kids are really helpful. Go ahead. All right. So a quick, if you're going to do this, it's not a shake down. Doesn't work. Okay, hang on. What it is a, Doolittle says it best, a firm quivering shake. So you hold it and it's down, up, and they fall off when the frame is going back up. They can't handle that change of direction. So it doesn't have to be violent. It's just like that. And the bees go. It's very easy. They get more upset when you brush them off, even though that seems gentler. When you try and brush them off, they'll fly up and try and get through the veil. When you just shake them, they just fall off. And they're like, whoops, I fell. And they walk into the hive. And so shaking bees is not a big, hairy deal if you do it right. If you're worried about doing it right, just smoke both sides of the frame thoroughly first and then shake them. And once you get the hang of it, no big deal. So we're doing large grafts, so we're doing bunches of nurse bees. So here's all the nurse bees marching in. It's pretty cool to watch, actually. And then we put a feeder on it, even if there's a honey flow. Because during that 5 days that they're feeding the cells, there isn't going to be a honey flow on rainy days. There isn't going to be a honey flow at night. There isn't going to be a honey flow if it gets above 85 degrees. The plants stop producing nectar. And so there's lots of situations where you just want to make sure they have plenty of food. And depending on what we have kicking around the honey house, we actually often feed them honey rather than sugar water. Because we cut it with water so it's more like nectar. But it's often honey. Go ahead. So there it is. This is the day before. So it's all set up. And what I like about this method is that there's no special equipment. You don't have any cloak boards. You aren't taking the entire colony and shaking it into a screen box and putting it in the back of your garage for a day or whatever. There's lots of versions that are much more convoluted.
You've been doing that with a 5-frame nuke this summer.
Yep.
That's pretty neat.
Yep. And with that, what we do is we put a second empty 5-frame nuke box above and have a can over the hole in the inner cover, because the 5-frame nuke feeders that they sell are garbage.
Yeah.
So we use a can for that. And then that extra box, if we get them too strong, then you'll look in that empty box the next day and it'll be full of all the excess bees. So it gives them kind of an overflow valve. Yep. Okay, go ahead. Any questions about the setup? Okay, moving on. Here's the day of the graft. This is what they should look like, or even a little stronger. But you want plenty of bees if you're going to raise nice queens. And so you go out first thing in the morning and you take out that frame of open brood and you either brush or you shake the bees back in. They should have started some little queen cups on some of the youngest larvae. And that's your best indicator, if they've done that, that they're ready to raise queens for you. Because they're trying to raise queens on the only frame that has right age larvae on it. And you're just about to take it away. Take that out. Depending on how you did it, that frame could have been from your breeder queen. And so that could be the frame that you're going to graft from. If you're going to graft from that frame, graft the ones that they started building cups around, because the bees know things that we don't. There's different reasons why they choose specific larvae. Sometimes it's because they're healthy, but there's also research that shows that the workers will preferentially choose half-sisters that are full sisters to them. So you understand that all the workers are half-sisters with all the other drones kids, right? But when a set of workers chooses to raise a queen, they preferentially choose a larva that is a full sister to them. And nobody knows how they know that, but that's true. And so in any case, they've selected ones that they're already willing to raise as queens. And so it's a good idea to go ahead and choose those same ones. The biggest reason being that they'll be on the biggest puddle of royal jelly because they've already been being fed as queens. And that makes them easiest to lift out.
Yeah.
The bigger the puddle of royal jelly, the easier it is to get your grafting tool under there and lift it out. Here's the queen cups.
15 in a bar?
15 on a bar if you want, but you can do a lot fewer. And I'd recommend starting with fewer. Go ahead. These are those, the cell cups you can get from anybody, Better Bee, Manlake. They're made by J's Bees. You can get them directly from J's Bees. We've quit using the wooden bars and gone to J's Bees plastic bars. After you've used the wooden bars for 8 or 10 years, the cups start to fall out. It gets really annoying. You have all these queen cells that are kind of down in the bottom of the cell builder, upside down. Sometimes they actually finish them. But it's much nicer when they don't fall out. The plastic ones, they stay in all the time. Not a huge fan of plastic, but that's a good use for it. Here's your larva. Let's go back. So here's eggs. You can see that?
Yeah.
And here's some larvae that are maybe a little on the big side. And here's some larvae that have just hatched from an egg. And that's really what you're looking for. My recommendation is when you first start grafting, don't get too hung up on the age. The bigger larvae are easier to graft, they're harder to injure, and they're harder to flip over. They have little vents that they breathe through, spiracles on the top. And if you take the larva out and you flip it and you put it in the other way around, it drowns. It might still be floating on top of the puddle, but the breathing holes are on the bottom. It can't breathe, it dies, so you killed it. So it has to stay right side up. And the way to pick it up is to grab it from the convex side by sliding the quill down the side of the cell, and then it naturally curves and slides under the puddle of royal jelly, and then you kind of hoist it out and attempt to straighten the quill without smashing the larva against the far side of the cell. Practice it with some bigger ones. You'll still get queens. They might not be perfect, but it's a great way to get started. And then as you get comfortable with lifting those larvae out, you can try the smaller ones. Okay, here's a really nice picture of a larva that's just right. Just remember that's with massive magnification. Okay. Here's my preferred style of grafting tool. This is a Chinese grafter. This is a little plunger made out of bamboo, and this is the quill. And because it is quill and not plastic, you can suck on it while you're grafting. So before you start grafting, when you're going to get the frame, stick it in your mouth and suck on it. What does that do? It softens it. Who played a reed instrument like a clarinet or something? Okay. Can't play it when the reed is dry, can you?
No.
Can't graft when the quill is dry. It punches through the bottom of the cell, or it doesn't bend and go under the puddle. And so this is the part where most people make a mistake, is they try and graft with a dry quill. Suck on it until it gets nice and soft. And then when you're in between bars or you're in between cells, stick it back in your mouth, clean the royal jelly off, soften it up some more, and keep going. Okay? Royal jelly is fine. The larvae are fine. You can eat all of it, it doesn't hurt you. So we usually like to set it up with a frame. We'll often put a frame in the queen mother colony just at the right time such that she lays it up, so we've got a whole frame of larvae that are all the right age. If you're only grafting a half a dozen or even a full frame of 30 or whatever, you can just choose any frame that has right age larvae on it. You can hunt and peck and just choose the right ones. If you're doing 300 and you're trying to get it done in a couple hours, you want to be able to just graft everything right in front of you. But on a small scale, you don't need a perfect frame like this. The black plastic foundation is pretty nice to graft off of too, because you don't punch through the bottom. And we make reverse splits with our queen mothers, with our breeder queens. And so it's a lot of new drawn comb. And so when we were using all wax foundation, we were punching through regularly. When we switched to the black plastic in the breeder colonies, it made it much easier to graft. So that makes a big difference too if you're practicing. Here's the technique. This is a metal, this is a German style grafting tool, but it's the same concept. You can see how you're picking it up by the royal jelly and then depositing it again on the royal jelly without flipping it, without straightening it out, without touching the larva with the tool. That's the correct technique. The plunger, the bamboo, is to get it off the quill. So you bend the quill onto the bottom of the cup and then you gently push it off with the plunger. And the plunger is pushing the royal jelly, not the larva. There's a larva on the quill. That's what they look like. That's how big they should be.
Magnified.
Magnified many, many times. What's this towel I've got here? To keep it moist. So we cover everything with damp towels. If the larvae dry out, they'll die, or at least they'll get sick, and they won't make very good queens. So any bar that you're working on, especially when you're slow at the beginning, keep it covered with dampness. How we doing?